Montana Territory, June 1876. The sun was just pushing over the ridge when a woman carrying a baby stumbled into the edge of Valen Whitlock's cattle pasture. Shoes torn, dress ripped at the hem, and eyes like storms. Valen spotted her from his saddle half a mile off. He was checking the west fence line when the glint of sunlight off her hair caught him. He squinted, heart thudding once in his chest. No one came that way unless they were running from something. He rode fast. By the time he reached her, she was on her knees in the grass, clutching the baby tight to her chest. The infant was crying a thin, desperate sound, and the woman was shaking. "Ma'am," Valen said as he dismounted. He kept his voice low, steady. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She turned her face up, and for a second he forgot how to breathe. She was young. Early 20s, maybe. Her lip was split and there was blood in her hair, but her back was straight. "I need help," she whispered. "You got it." He dropped to one knee beside her, careful not to spook her. "What's your name?" "Florence," she said. "Florence Langley. This is my daughter. Her name's Hattie." "All right, Florence." He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and reached carefully for the baby. "Let me carry her for you. My horse is just over the hill. We'll get you warm and fed." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she let him take the child. Hattie blinked up at him with wide blue eyes, cheeks red from crying. Valen didn't say anything. Just held the baby close to his chest, where she settled a little. Florence followed him on foot, limping. He offered to lift her into the saddle, but she shook her head. "I can walk." They made it back to his cabin in silence, except for the wind and the baby's soft hiccups. The place was simple, one-room, stone fireplace, bed tucked in the back, a cot folded against the wall, and a cook stove he barely used. Valen stoked a fire, laid Hattie in a wooden crate lined with wool, and handed Florence a cup of warm water first, then soup. She ate like someone who had not had a real meal in days. When she finished, she looked up at him with clear, tired eyes. "You live out here alone?" "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "You always help strangers who wander onto your land?" "No," he said. "Just you?" Florence's hands trembled slightly around the cup. "I left my husband." Valen leaned back in his chair. "You do not owe me an explanation." "I do," she said. "Because I would not be here if I thought I could keep Hattie safe any other way." He did not move. "He hurt you?" She nodded once. Valen looked into the fire. He had seen enough in his year's war, death, loss to recognize the quiet in her voice. The way she held herself like she was waiting to run again. "I used to think love was worth anything," she said. "But I was wrong." He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "Love ain't worth the pain." Florence looked at him, something raw in her face. "You sound like you know that from experience." "I do." They did not speak again for a long time. Hattie slept in the crate, her little chest rising and falling steady. Outside, the wind blew over the hills. Florence stayed the night. Valen folded out the cot and slept in front of the fire. In the morning, he found her standing by the window, Hattie in her arms, staring out at the land like she expected someone to come riding up the trail. "No one knows you are here," he said. She turned, her expression unreadable. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not." Florence hesitated. "I will work. I can cook, clean, help with the garden. I am not asking for anything." She crossed her arms tightly, hugging Hattie closer. "I need to earn my place." Valen nodded once. "Then stay." Over the next few days, Florence settled into the rhythm of the place. She washed linens, swept the floor, boiled water for baths. Valen watched her from a distance, unsure how to reach her without scaring her off. He had not wanted company for a long time. After the war ended, he rode west with nothing but a busted shoulder and a head full of ghosts. He built the cabin by hand, broke the land, raised cattle, and kept to himself. People said he was cold. Maybe he was. He did not mind, but Florence was different. She never asked him to talk. Just worked quietly, tended to Hattie, and made the cabin feel like something warmer than a place to sleep. One morning, a week after she arrived, Valen was sitting on the porch sharpening a knife when Florence came out with Hattie in her arms. "Mind if we sit with you?" she asked. He gestured to the bench beside him. Florence sat, bounced Hattie gently on her lap. The baby reached out suddenly, little fingers brushing Valen's beard. He froze. Florence laughed, the sound soft and full of something he had not heard in her before. "She likes you?" Valen looked down at the baby. Hattie smiled up at him with all the trust in the world. His chest twisted. He reached out, let her grab his thumb. Her fingers closed around it, warm and small. Florence watched him with a look he could not read. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just forgot what this felt like." "What?" "Being wanted." Florence's smile faded, but her eyes stayed soft. "You are not the only one who forgot." He looked at her. Really looked, and she was not just the woman who ran. She was someone strong enough to leave, to protect her child, to trust again if only a little. He cleared his throat. "I am gonna patch the east fence today. You and Hattie can come if you want." Florence nodded. "We will." They rode out together that afternoon, Florence in the saddle with Hattie wrapped tight against her chest, Valen leading the way. The sky stretched wide and blue, and for the first time in years, Valen felt something calm settle in his bones. He had sworn love was not worth the pain. But then her baby had reached for his beard and smiled. And something in him started to believe it might be. The soil was heavy with spring melt, soft under Valen's boots as he tamped the last fence post into place. Florence stood a little ways back with Hattie on her hip, her skirt mudded at the hem, hair pulled into a loose braid that had started to fall apart in the wind. "That looks like it'll hold," she said, adjusting the baby's bonnet against the sun. Valen leaned against the post driver, wiping sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "Ought to get through the season, long as no elk come testing it." Florence shifted Hattie to her other side. "Do they come down this far?" "Sometimes." He pointed toward the tree line where the slope thickened with pine. "They bed up in those woods. Come morning you'll see tracks across the pasture." Her eyes followed where he pointed, scanning the ridgeline. "It's quiet out here." "I haven't heard anything but wind and birds since we left the cabin." He nodded. "That's why I stayed." She didn't answer for a while, just watched the breeze stir the grass. Then, without looking at him, she said, "I used to think silence meant something was wrong. Now I think it might be the only thing that doesn't lie." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't speak. Instead, he walked to the wagon and fetched a tin cup of water, handed it to her. She drank, then passed it back, careful not to let their fingers touch. They loaded the tools together. Hattie had fallen asleep again, her head tucked beneath Florence's chin, one hand curled near her mother's collarbone. Valen glanced at them once, then looked away. They rode back slowly, the wagon creaking under the weight of the day. Florence sat beside him on the bench, both of them quiet, the reins loose in his fingers. Halfway back, she asked, "Did you ever think about leaving?" He shook his head. "Didn't see the point, not even once." "No," her mouth pressed into a line. "I thought about it every day. Even before he started drinking. I'd picture a place like this, where no one knew my name." He didn't ask what kept her. He had a good guess. The sun dipped behind the hills by the time they reached the cabin. Valen unhitched the horse and led it to the corral while Florence carried Hattie inside. When he came in, she was lighting the oil lamp on the table, her face gold in the glow. "I found some beans and dried apple in the cupboard," she said. "If that's all right. You don't have to ask." She stirred the pot in silence while he washed up at the basin. The scent of the apples filled the room, warm and familiar. He hadn't tasted anything like that since his mother's kitchen, back before everything in his life had come apart. When they sat down to eat, Florence kept her eyes on her bowl. "You said you knew what hurt like mine feels like." He kept his spoon moving, slow and steady. "I lost someone, after the war. Woman I thought I'd marry, caught a fever while I was still down in Texas driving cattle by the time I made it back to Kansas. They'd already put her in the ground." She looked up then, her gaze sharp with recognition. "You never got to say goodbye." He shook his head once. "Didn't even know she was sick." The lantern clicked softly as the flame flickered. Florence set her spoon down carefully. "I was 17 when I married. My father said it was a good match, land came with it, but I didn't know what a good man looked like, still not sure I do." Valen met her eyes. "You'll know next time." She held his gaze longer than she had before. Will there be a next time? He didn't answer. Not yet. That night, after Hattie was asleep and the fire had burned low, Florence stepped outside onto the porch. Valen followed her out a few minutes later, pulling on his coat against the cool. The sky above was littered with stars, the kind you only saw when you were far from everything. Florence leaned against the post, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't cry once today, she's feeling safe. Florence looked down at her hands. I didn't think I'd ever be able to give her that. You did. He paused. You are. A shadow passed over her face. You're kind and steady. I don't know how to be around that yet. You don't have to be anything but yourself. She turned to him slowly. That's the part I'm still figuring out. He nodded, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small wooden horse, its edges smooth from years of handling. Made this when I was 18. Was supposed to be for a brother that never came. She took it gently, turning it over in her palm. You still carried it. Didn't know why I kept it. Guess I do now. Her eyes softened as she looked up at him, the toy cradled against her chest. You're not what I expected out here. Neither are you. She let out a breath, and it sounded like something easing loose from her ribs. I don't want to be afraid anymore. You're allowed to stop running. And then, for the first time since she arrived, she stepped closer. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him. They stood like that for a long while, the stars above, the wind soft through the grass, and the hush between them no longer heavy but full of possibility. Inside, Hattie stirred, then settled again. The world was quiet, and for the first time, Valen didn't feel alone in it. The days stretched longer with July easing in, the air richer with the scent of warm pine and cattle musk. Valen was hauling timber from the creek bed when Florence appeared beside him. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, a small saw held awkward in her hand. I can help, she said, not waiting for permission. He studied the way she held the tool, uncertain but determined. You ever cut pine before? She shook her head. But I watched my uncle build a smokehouse once. I paid attention. Valen set his saw aside and stepped back. All right. Try this one. Florence knelt beside the log he'd half cleared of bark, adjusted her grip, and began working her way through the wood. Her strokes were uneven, shallow at first, but she kept at it. He didn't correct her, just watched, and when the blade finally bit clean, she sat back with a breathless grin, cheeks flushed. I did it. You did, he said, handing her a tin flask of water. You want to learn how to square it? She wiped her forehead and nodded. Every part. By evening, they had 4 timbers ready to dry. Valen stacked them under the lean-to while Florence checked on Hattie, who'd spent the afternoon napping in a basket under the porch awning, shaded and swaddled in one of Valen's old flannel shirts. As dusk settled, Florence lingered by the corral, watching the cattle drift toward the troughs. You ever get tired of the quiet? She asked. Valen joined her, arms folded on the top rail. I used to think I liked being alone more than I did. She turned, considering him. What changed? He didn't look away from the pasture. You stopped running. Florence's fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. You never asked what happened that night, before I came. I figured you'd say when you were ready. She stepped a little closer. He broke a chair across the wall near Hattie's cradle. Didn't hit me, not that time, but I saw his eyes and I knew the next time it wouldn't be the wall. Valen's jaw tightened. You were right to leave. I left everything I had, even my mother's photograph. I brought only her and a blanket. You brought the only thing that mattered. Florence glanced up at him. I don't know what this place is yet or what I am in it. You're safe. And needed. She held his gaze, and something quiet passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but the space where one might take root. Later, as fireflies rose from the grass and the frogs began their low chorus, Valen brought out 2 chairs and set them beside the front steps. Florence laid Hattie down inside, humming a tune he didn't recognize. Then she joined him, pulling her shawl tight against the cooling air. You ever think about starting over? She asked after a long pause. I thought I had, when I came west. Turns out, burying something isn't the same as healing it. Florence leaned back, her eyes on the dark silhouette of the hills. I've never had a place that felt like it could belong to me. You could. She looked over, her voice barely above the wind. And what would that take? Time. And someone who doesn't expect you to be small. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. You're not afraid of ghosts, are you? I live with mine. She nodded slowly, then reached out not to touch. Not yet, but her fingers hovered near his on the armrest, close enough he could feel her warmth. Inside, Hattie stirred once, then quieted. Valen watched Florence's profile, the way her shoulders had begun to uncoil, the set of her mouth steadier than it had been. I used to think love was something you survived, she said softly. Now I wonder if it's something you build. He turned his hand over, palm up beside hers. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid into his, dry and calloused from work, but unshaking. There was no need for more words. The stars were out again, and the wind had shifted, cooler now, brushing through the cottonwoods like a lullaby. And somewhere between the firelight and the dark, a woman who had fled with nothing and a man who had buried too much, found the beginning of something neither had dared hope for, not just safety, not just peace, but a home. The first hard rain of summer came in the early dusk, sudden and heavy, drumming steady against the roof shingles and soaking the pasture in minutes. Valen leaned his shoulder against the window frame, watching the cattle bunch near the windbreak, their backs hunched to the downpour. Behind him, Florence was quiet, folding strips of muslin into neat squares beside the hearth. Hattie lay on a quilt nearby, one hand curled around the corner of a worn cloth doll Valen had found in a trunk weeks back, long forgotten from a neighbor's child who'd passed through years ago. You always get storms like this in July, Florence asked, not looking up. Most years, Valen said, ground's thirsty enough to hold it. She smoothed the last of the folded cloths and sat back on her heels. I used to love the sound. Before I had to listen for footsteps under it. Valen turned from the window, letting her words settle. The fire cracked gently behind them, its glow soft over the wood-planked floor. I was thinking, she said, shifting her weight, if you want, I could start sewing extra linens. For trade, maybe. I still remember my mother's patterns. She used to stitch initials into the corners. He nodded once. We've got bolts of cotton in the loft. I'll bring them down after the rain. Thank you. Silence stretched again, but it wasn't hollow. Hattie let out a small sigh in her sleep, and Florence turned slightly, just enough so Valen could see the faint curve of a smile she hadn't meant to show. You ever think about going back to Kansas? She asked, voice low. No, he said. Everything I had there's buried. She traced a fingertip along the grain of the floorboard. I thought if I ever got out I'd want to disappear, but I don't, not anymore. Valen took a step closer, slow and deliberate. You're not gone, Florence, you're right here. She raised her eyes to his. Is that something you believe, or something you're teaching yourself to say? He considered her honestly. Both. The lamp on the table flickered as a gust of wind pressed against the walls. Florence looked toward the window, then back at him. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone. But I think that was just fear dressed up in pride. Valen crouched beside the hearth, tending the coals. I used to think the same until I started looking forward to hearing you sing to her. She blinked, but didn't look away. You never say much unless you mean it. I never saw much good in wasting words. Florence shifted, her knees pulled beneath her. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers laced. I think I'm starting to believe this could be real. But I don't know what to do with that yet. You don't have to know, just stay. Her breath caught and she nodded once sharp, certain. I want to, she said. Valen stood slowly, watching her face, her steady gaze. Then we'll make room for that. Day by day. They both turned as Hattie stirred, her small hands reaching into the stillness. Florence went to her, lifting her gently, cradling her against her chest. The baby blinked up at the room, then reached one sleepy hand toward Valen. Florence hesitated, then turned toward him. She wants you. Valen stepped forward, heart thudding in a way he didn't try to name. He took the child carefully, settling her in the crook of his arm. Her fingers brushed his beard, and she gave a soft, contented sigh. Florence watched him, something deep and unguarded in her expression. She doesn't reach for anyone else but me. Valen glanced down at the infant nestled against him. She knows where she's safe. Florence moved closer, not touching, but near enough he could feel the warmth of her. So do I. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, everything held still. Not in fear, not in waiting, but in peace, hard-earned and real. And Valen, who had once said love wasn't worth the pain, stood with a child in his arms and a woman beside him, and knew he'd been wrong. The wheatgrass had turned gold by August, brittle at the tips and whispering dry music underfoot. On the far side of Valen's property, where the land sloped gently toward a shaded draw, Florence stood ankle-deep in late summer bloom, her dress caught in the breeze. Hattie was wrapped snug in a sling on her back, one tiny fist curled against her mother's shoulder. Valen approached from the barn, a length of coiled rope slung over one shoulder. His shirt clung to him, damp from labor, and there was dust in his beard, but his eyes were steady on her. "You looking for something?" he asked. Florence tilted her head, eyes half closed against the sun. "I think I found it already." He stopped beside her, glancing toward the horizon. "I've been clearing the field near the north fence, thought it might do better with wheat next year." "What made you decide that?" "Cattle feeds holding steady, and you said you knew how to grind flour." "Figured we'd see what comes of it." She smiled, and it was the kind that didn't hide itself. "You're planning for 2 winters out. 3 if we dig that root cellar deeper come frost." Florence shifted her stance, careful not to jostle Hattie. "I never planned more than a week ahead before this." "You do now," Valen said. They stood like that for a while, the quiet between them different now, anchored, not hesitant. Florence reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve, her fingers brushing the coarse fabric. "I keep waking up expecting this to fall away." Valen turned toward her, his voice low. "It won't." She looked down, brushing a thumb along Hattie's blanket. "I never thought I'd want to stay in one place again, but I've started thinking about planting fruit trees. Maybe along the rise where the wind isn't as sharp. I can fence it in, keep the deer out." Florence's gaze lifted to his. "You do that?" "I'd do anything that keeps you here." The words landed without weight or rush, just truth, settled in the space between them. "You can build a life from nothing," she said. "I didn't know that until now." "You didn't build from nothing," Valen said. "You brought her, you brought yourself, that's everything." Florence reached up and unfastened Hattie from the sling, cradling her against her chest. "She's starting to recognize voices. She quiets when you talk. She's got good sense." Florence gave a soft laugh, and Valen stepped closer, brushing a bit of hay from her shoulder. His hand lingered, not for long, but long enough. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building a second room. One with a real door." She gave him a look, quiet, cautious, hopeful. "That's a big change." "I figure it's time." Florence shifted Hattie into the crook of her arm. "And what would the room be for? For you, for her, for us, if you'll have it." She didn't answer at first. Just looked at him, her eyes steady and wet at the edges, the wind tugging gently at the loose strands of her hair. "I don't want to be a guest here anymore," she said. "I want to belong. You already do." Florence stepped into him, close enough that their bodies brushed. She laid her free hand against his chest. "I never thought I'd say yes to anyone again," she said. "But I'll say it to you." Valen leaned down, and when their lips met, it wasn't rushed or fierce, it was sure. It was the kind of kiss that settled things. That said what words couldn't. Hattie stirred softly between them, and Florence pulled back just enough to look down at her. She's going to grow up with her own room, a garden. A mother who's not afraid. And a man who'll never raise his voice unless he's calling her in for supper. Florence smiled through her tears, and Valen reached to cradle both mother and daughter close. They walked back to the cabin as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the pasture. That night, Florence cooked potatoes with sage from the garden she'd started in a corner of the yard. Valen carved a cradle from pine he'd been seasoning since spring. When the wind rose, they sat by the fire, Florence's feet tucked beneath her, Hattie sleeping between them on a folded quilt. By the time the first frost came, the second room was built simple, paneled with pine, a shuttered window that opened to the south. Florence chose the curtain fabric herself, and Valen carved a heart into the lintel beam when no one was watching. They married in mid-September, in the clearing behind the cabin, with the preacher from Three Forks and a neighbor woman as witness. Florence wore a blue dress she'd sewn from a bolt Valen found behind old ledger books. Hattie sat in a basket at their feet, chewing on the corner of a kerchief. There were no grand speeches, just hands clasped and eyes that didn't look away. Afterward, Florence planted the first apple tree beside the porch. Valen built a bench beneath it. And for years to come, they sat there together each evening, Hattie growing tall in the yard, her laugh rising with the wind, and love settling into the bones of the place like it had always meant to be there.